Dark Stark, the substitute teacher. I was a substitute teacher at Roosevelt Elementary, and I'd been working there for about 3 months when this happened. It was a Tuesday in late October, and I was covering for Mrs. Patterson's 3rd grade class. The regular teacher had called in sick that morning, so I got the call at 6 a.m. asking if I could come in. Roosevelt Elementary was one of those older schools built in the 1960s. Long hallways, high ceilings, and those big windows that let in way too much light during the day, but felt ominous when it got dark. My classroom was at the very end of the East Wing, room 127, which meant I was pretty isolated from the main part of the school. The day started normally enough. 22 3rd graders, all excited because they had a substitute. You know how kids get. They think having a sub means it's going to be a free-for-all. I had to establish control pretty quickly, but once I did, they were actually really well-behaved kids. We were in the middle of reading time when it happened. It was around 1:30 p.m., and I had the kids sitting in a circle on the carpet while I read them a story about a friendly ghost. Ironic, considering what was about to happen. The lockdown announcement came over the intercom, but something was immediately wrong with it. Usually when they did lockdown drills, the principal, Mr. Henderson, would come on and speak in his normal, calm voice. This time it was a woman's voice I didn't recognize, and she sounded panicked. "All teachers, implement lockdown procedures immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." The kids all looked at me with those wide, confused eyes that children get when they sense something's wrong but don't understand what. I tried to keep my voice steady as I told them we were going to play a quiet game and that they needed to move to the corner of the room away from the windows. I locked the classroom door and turned off the lights, just like we'd practiced in the drills. But as I was pulling down the window shades, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a man standing in the parking lot, maybe 50 yards from our window. He was wearing dark clothes and just standing there, perfectly still, staring directly at our building. What made it worse was that he was holding something in his hands. From that distance, I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but it was long and dark, and the way he was holding it made my stomach drop. I quickly finished closing the blinds and gathered the children in the corner. 22 little faces looking up at me, trusting me to keep them safe. Some of them were starting to cry quietly, picking up on the tension in the room. "Are we going to be okay, Miss Sarah?" whispered Emma, a little girl with pigtails who always sat in the front row. "Of course we are," I told her, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We're just practicing being very quiet." That's when we heard the first sound from the hallway. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming down the corridor toward our wing of the building. The thing is, during a lockdown, no one should be walking around. Teachers and staff are supposed to stay in their rooms, and any security or police would identify themselves. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. I held my breath and put my finger to my lips, signaling the children to stay absolutely silent. We could hear someone trying the door handle. The metal made a soft clicking sound as whoever was out there turned it back and forth, testing to see if it was locked. Then came the knocking. Not the kind of knocking you'd expect from a teacher or administrator checking on classrooms. This was slow, methodical knocking. 3 knocks. Pause, 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. One of the boys, Tyler, started to whimper. I quickly moved over to him and put my hand gently on his shoulder, shaking my head to remind him to stay quiet. The knocking stopped, but the footsteps didn't move away. We could hear whoever it was just standing there right outside our door. The silence was almost worse than the knocking. Then a voice came through the door. A man's voice, speaking in an unnaturally calm, almost sing-song tone. "I know you're in there. I can hear the children breathing." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the kids could hear it. Several of them were crying now, but they were being so brave, keeping their sobs as quiet as possible. "Open the door," the voice continued. "I just want to talk to the children. I have something to show them." I looked around the room frantically, trying to think of what to do. My cell phone was on my desk, but I'd have to cross the room to get it, and I was afraid any movement might give away our exact location. The man outside started talking again, but this time, his voice had changed. It was higher pitched, like he was trying to sound like a child. Teacher, can we come out and play? We promise we'll be good. We just want to see our friends. That's when I realized something that made the situation even more terrifying. This person knew we were a classroom full of children. He wasn't just randomly trying doors. He was specifically targeting us. The door handle rattled again, more aggressively this time. Then we heard a scraping sound, like metal against metal. He was trying to pick the lock, or force it somehow. I made a decision. I quietly moved to my desk and grabbed my cell phone, then crept back to the children. I dialed 911, keeping the phone on silent. 911? What's your emergency? The dispatcher whispered when she answered. I'm a teacher at Roosevelt Elementary, I whispered back, barely audible. We're in lockdown, and there's someone trying to get into my classroom. Room 1, 27, East Wing. Ma'am, we already have units responding to your school. Can you confirm your location and the number of people with you? 22 children and myself, 3rd grade. The person is right outside our door. As I was talking, the scraping sound at the door got louder. Then we heard something that made everyone in the room freeze. The sound of the lock clicking open. The door handle turned slowly, and the door began to creak open, just a crack. A sliver of hallway light cut through the darkness of our classroom. I ended the call and moved protectively in front of the children, my mind racing through options. The windows were too high for the kids to climb out, and there was nowhere else to hide. The door opened wider, and I could see a shadow in the doorway. But then, suddenly, we heard shouting from down the hallway. Police! Stop right there! The shadow in our doorway disappeared instantly. We heard running footsteps going away from our room. Then more shouting. Then what sounded like a struggle. I kept the children in the corner for another 10 minutes until we heard Mr. Henderson's voice over the intercom, speaking in his normal, calm tone. All clear. Teachers, please remain in your rooms until police officers come to escort you out. When the police officer finally came to our room, he was accompanied by Mr. Henderson. The officer was a kind-looking woman who immediately knelt down to the children's level and spoke to them in a gentle voice. You all did such a good job staying quiet and safe, she told them. You should be very proud of yourselves. As we were being escorted out of the building, I overheard some of the details from the other officers. The man had somehow gotten into the school through a maintenance entrance. He'd been going from classroom to classroom, trying to get teachers to open their doors. He told them he was a new substitute teacher who had gotten locked out of his assigned room. What made it even more disturbing was what they found in his backpack when they arrested him. Zip ties, duct tape, and a list of names. All children's names. They never told us if any of the names on the list were from our school, but the way the officers looked when they talked about it told me everything I needed to know. The man was apparently someone who had been fired from a school district in another state for inappropriate behavior with students. He'd been targeting elementary schools, looking for opportunities to get close to children. The thing that still haunts me is how he knew exactly what to say to try to get us to open the door. He'd clearly done this before, or at least planned it extensively. The way he changed his voice to sound like a child, the patient way he tried to pick the lock. It wasn't impulsive. It was calculated. I found out later that he'd been watching the school for weeks, learning the routines, figuring out which classrooms were most isolated. Our room, at the end of the East Wing, had been his primary target all along. The children were incredibly brave that day, but several of them needed counseling afterward. Emma, the little girl who asked if we were going to be okay, had nightmares for months. Tyler's parents ended up transferring him to a different school. As for me, I couldn't go back to substitute teaching. Every time I walked into a classroom, I'd find myself checking the locks on the doors, looking at the windows, planning escape routes. The trust that you need to have in your environment to do that job effectively was just gone. The man was eventually sentenced to 15 years in prison. During his trial, it came out that he'd attempted similar incidents at 3 other schools in different states. We were just the first place where he'd actually managed to get inside. I still think about those 22 children and how different that day could have ended. How a simple twist of fate, the police arriving when they did, the lock holding just long enough, was all that stood between those kids and something unthinkable. The school installed new security measures after that incident. Better locks, cameras, a more sophisticated lockdown system. But I know that for those children, and for me, the feeling of safety in what should be the most secure place in their world was permanently shattered. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if he'd gotten that door open just 30 seconds earlier before the police arrived. It's a thought that still wakes me up at night, even years later. I was 17 and working my first real job as a night janitor at Westfield High School. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid decent money for a high school student, and I could work around my class schedule since I only worked 3 nights a week from 6 p.m. to midnight. The job was pretty straightforward. Empty trash cans, mop floors, clean bathrooms, and make sure all the classrooms were ready for the next day. The school was huge, built in the 1980s with 3 separate wings connected by a central commons area. During the day, it housed about 1,800 students. But at night, it was just me and my supervisor, Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia was in his 50s and had been doing this job for over 20 years. He was a quiet guy who mostly kept to himself, but he was always fair with me and never made me feel stupid when I had questions about the work. We had a system where he'd take the north and south wings, and I'd handle the east wing in the commons area. This particular night was a Thursday in February. It had been snowing all day, and the parking lot was covered in about 6 inches of fresh powder. Mr. Garcia and I arrived at our usual time, and everything seemed normal. We went through our routine. He gave me the keys to the supply closets, we checked the heating system, and then we split up to start our work. I always started in the commons area because it was the biggest space and took the longest. The commons was this huge open area with tables where students ate lunch and studied. It had these massive windows that looked out onto the courtyard, and during the day, it was always full of natural light. At night, though, with just the security lighting, it felt cavernous and echoey. I was about an hour into my shift, mopping near the main entrance, when I heard something that made me stop. It sounded like voices coming from outside. Not unusual necessarily. Sometimes people walked by the school, or cars would drive through the parking lot. But these voices sounded like they were right outside the main doors. I walked over to the windows and looked out, but I couldn't see anyone. The snow was still falling pretty heavily, which made it hard to see very far. I figured it was probably just some kids walking home from basketball practice or something, so I went back to mopping. About 20 minutes later, I heard the voices again. This time they were definitely closer, and I could make out that it was multiple people talking, though I couldn't understand what they were saying. I looked out the windows again, and this time, I saw them. There were 4 people standing in the courtyard, maybe 30 feet from the building. They were all wearing dark clothes and had their hoods up, so I couldn't see their faces clearly. What struck me as odd was that they weren't moving. They were just standing there in the falling snow, looking at the building. I watched them for a few minutes, trying to figure out what they were doing. They seemed to be pointing at different parts of the building and talking to each other. One of them had something in their hand that looked like it might be a phone or a small flashlight. I decided I should probably tell Mr. Garcia about it, so I walked toward the north wing to find him. The hallways at night were lit only by emergency lighting, which created these long shadows that always made me a little nervous. I found him in one of the science classrooms, wiping down lab tables. "Hey, Mr. Garcia," I said. "There are some people outside in the courtyard. They've been standing there for a while, just looking at the building." He stopped what he was doing and looked at me with a concerned expression. "How many people?" "4, I think. They're all wearing dark clothes with hoods up." Mr. Garcia set down his cleaning supplies and walked with me back toward the commons area. When we got to the windows, the people were gone. "I swear, they were right there," I told him, pointing to where I'd seen them standing. He looked out at the empty courtyard for a long moment. Probably just kids messing around. "But let's keep an eye out, okay? If you see them again, come find me right away." I went back to my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why would anyone be standing outside a school at night in a snowstorm? And why had they been pointing at the building like that? About an hour later, I was cleaning classrooms in the east wing when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of one of the exterior doors opening and closing. Each door in the building had a distinctive sound when it opened. A heavy click followed by the whoosh of air, and then the thud when it closed. I stopped what I was doing and listened. The building was supposed to be locked up tight. Mr. Garcia and I had keys, but all the exterior doors should have been secured. I waited, listening for footsteps or voices, but everything was silent. I decided to go check the main entrance where I'd heard the sound. As I walked through the commons area, I noticed that one of the main doors was slightly ajar. The snow was blowing in through the gap, creating a small pile of white on the floor. My first thought was that maybe the wind had blown it open, but these doors were heavy and had automatic locks. They couldn't just blow open on their own. I walked over to close the door, and that's when I saw the footprints. Fresh footprints in the snow, leading from the parking lot right up to the door. But what made my stomach drop was that the footprints didn't stop at the door. They continued inside the building. Wet footprints on the tile floor, leading from the entrance into the commons area, and then disappearing where the floor was dry. I immediately went to find Mr. Garcia. I practically ran through the hallways, my heart pounding. I found him in the south wing, and when he saw my face, he knew something was wrong. "Someone's in the building," I told him, trying to keep my voice steady. "The main door was open, and there are footprints leading inside." Mr. Garcia's expression became very serious. "Are you sure?" "Positive. Fresh snow, wet footprints on the floor. Someone came in within the last few minutes." He pulled out his cell phone and started dialing. "We're calling the police," he said, "and then we're getting out of here." As he was talking to the 911 dispatcher, we heard something that confirmed our worst fears. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from somewhere in the building. They echoed through the empty hallways, making it impossible to tell exactly where they were coming from. Mr. Garcia finished his call and grabbed my arm. "The police are on their way. We need to get to the main office and lock ourselves in until they get here." We started walking quickly toward the main office, which was located near the front entrance. But as we got closer to the commons area, we could hear more sounds. It wasn't just one person. There were definitely multiple people in the building now. We could hear voices, low and muffled, coming from different directions. It sounded like they were communicating with each other, coordinating something. When we reached the main office, Mr. Garcia used his master key to unlock the door, and we both went inside. He locked the door behind us and turned off the lights. The office had a window that looked out into the commons area, but we stayed low, so we couldn't be seen. "What do you think they want?" I whispered. "I don't know," Mr. Garcia replied, But schools have computers, equipment, sometimes cash from fundraisers. Could be thieves. We sat in the dark office for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 15 minutes. We could hear the intruders moving around the building, opening and closing doors, talking to each other in voices too low for us to understand. At one point, we heard them in the hallway right outside the office. Footsteps stopped directly in front of our door, and we could see shadows moving under the crack at the bottom. Someone tried the door handle, turning it slowly and quietly. I held my breath, terrified that they would somehow be able to get in. Mr. Garcia had his hand on his cell phone, ready to call 911 again if needed. The person outside the door tried the handle a few more times, then moved on. We heard their footsteps continuing down the hallway. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we saw flashing red and blue lights through the window. The police had arrived. We could hear car doors slamming and voices outside. Within minutes, we heard the police entering the building, calling out and identifying themselves. There was a lot of shouting and commotion, and then everything went quiet. A police officer knocked on the office door and identified himself. Mr. Garcia unlocked the door, and we came out to find the building swarming with cops. We found evidence that multiple people were in here, the officer told us. Muddy footprints throughout the building, some doors that had been forced open, and a few classrooms that were ransacked. But whoever was here is gone now. They had us walk through the building with them to see if anything was missing or damaged. What we found was disturbing. It wasn't random vandalism or theft. The intruders had specifically targeted certain areas: the computer lab, the main office files, and the guidance counselor's office where student records were kept. In the computer lab, several machines had been turned on, and it looked like someone had been trying to access files. In the guidance office, filing cabinets had been opened and papers were scattered around. "This doesn't look like a typical break-in," one of the detectives said. "It looks like they were looking for specific information." The investigation revealed that the intruders had somehow obtained a key card that gave them access to the building. They'd been inside for almost an hour before we discovered them, and they'd managed to escape when they heard the police sirens. What made it even more unsettling was what the police found in the parking lot. Tire tracks in the snow showed that there had been at least 2 vehicles, and they'd found cigarette butts and energy drink cans near where the cars had been parked. It suggested that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. They'd been planning and waiting. The school district launched a full investigation, and it turned out that this wasn't an isolated incident. Similar break-ins had occurred at 3 other schools in the district over the past month. In each case, the intruders had targeted student records and computer systems. Eventually, the police discovered that it was part of an identity theft ring. The criminals were stealing student information, social security numbers, addresses, parent information, and selling it to people who used it to open credit cards and bank accounts. They were never caught, at least not for our break-in. The investigation went on for months, but the trail went cold. The school district upgraded all their security systems and changed all the locks, but the damage was done. For me, the worst part wasn't even the break-in itself. It was the realization of how vulnerable we'd been. 2 people alone in a massive building with no real security beyond locked doors. If those intruders had wanted to hurt us, instead of just steal information, there wouldn't have been much we could do to stop them. I finished out the school year in that job, but I never felt safe there again. Every sound, every shadow, every unexpected noise made me think they were back. Mr. Garcia and I started working closer together after that, never splitting up to cover different wings of the building. The school eventually hired a security guard for the night shift, but by then, I'd already decided to find a different job. Some experiences change you, and that night was one of them. The idea that people could just walk into a place where you're supposed to feel safe, where hundreds of kids spend their days, and violate that space for their own purposes, it was something I couldn't get past. Even now, years later, I still think about those 4 figures standing in the courtyard, pointing at the building and planning their invasion. I wonder how long they've been watching, how much they knew about our routines, and what might have happened if we'd confronted them instead of hiding in that office. I was a senior at Millbrook High School and president of the student council. It was a position I'd worked toward for 3 years, and I took it seriously. Our school had about 1,200 students, and the student council was responsible for organizing events, addressing student concerns, and serving as a liaison between the administration and the student body. Every other Wednesday, we held our meetings in the conference room adjacent to the main office. It was a small room with a long table, whiteboards on the walls, and windows that looked out onto the senior parking lot. The meetings usually lasted about an hour and were attended by the 8 elected council members, plus our faculty advisor, Ms. Rodriguez. This particular Wednesday in March, we were planning our annual Spring Carnival fundraiser. It was our biggest event of the year, and we needed to finalize vendor contracts, coordinate with the facilities department, and assign volunteer shifts. Ms. Rodriguez had to leave early for a family emergency, which wasn't unusual. She trusted us to handle meetings on our own when necessary. The council members present that day were myself, Vice President Jake Morrison, Secretary Emma Chen, Treasurer David Park, and 4 class representatives, Sarah Williams, Marcus Thompson, Ashley Davis, and Tyler Brooks. We were all friends who had worked together for most of high school, so the dynamic was comfortable and productive. We'd been meeting for about 45 minutes when the lockdown announcement came over the intercom, but something was immediately wrong with it. Instead of our principal, Dr. Martinez, making the announcement, it was the voice of Mrs. Patterson, one of the office secretaries. Her voice was shaking and she sounded terrified. All students and staff, we are implementing lockdown procedures immediately. This is not a drill. Please secure your classrooms and remain silent until further notice. The 8 of us looked at each other with confusion and growing alarm. Lockdown drills were always announced in advance, and they never happened during after-school activities. Plus, Mrs. Patterson's voice had a quality to it that made my stomach drop. Pure fear. Jake immediately went to lock the conference room door while Emma turned off the lights. The rest of us moved away from the windows and huddled near the back wall. Since we were right next to the main office, we could hear activity in the hallway. Hurried footsteps, muffled voices, and what sounded like people moving quickly. "What do you think is happening?" Sarah whispered. "Maybe there's someone with a weapon in the building," Marcus replied quietly. David pulled out his phone and started texting his parents, but then stopped. "Should we be using our phones? What if someone can track the signals?" I tried to think logically about the situation. As student council president, I'd been briefed on emergency procedures more extensively than regular students. I knew that lockdowns could be called for various reasons: intruders, nearby police activity, or credible threats. But the terror in Mrs. Patterson's voice suggested this was something serious. We sat in tense silence for about 10 minutes. Then we started hearing sounds that made the situation feel much more real and frightening. There were voices in the hallway, but they weren't the voices of teachers or administrators. These were unfamiliar male voices, and they were speaking loudly enough that we could make out some of what they were saying. "Check every room. Make sure they're all secured. How many do you think are still in the building? Doesn't matter. We control the situation now." Ashley grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with terror. The way these people were talking, it sounded like they were the ones in charge, not the school administration. That meant whatever was happening, it wasn't a drill or a precautionary lockdown. Tyler, who was sitting closest to the door, held up his hand for us to be even quieter. We could hear footsteps approaching our hallway. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with purpose. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. We could see shadows moving under the crack at the bottom of the door. Someone tried the handle, turning it slowly. When it didn't open, we heard a man's voice say, "This one's locked. There might be people inside." Another voice responded, "Leave it for now. We'll come back if we need to." The footsteps moved away, but we could still hear the men talking as they continued down the hallway. They were discussing something about securing the perimeter and maintaining control of the exits. It sounded like military or police terminology, but these definitely weren't police officers. Emma was crying silently, and David looked like he was about to be sick. Jake was trying to text someone on his phone, but he kept shaking his head in frustration. "No signal," he whispered. "I can't get any of my messages to go through." That's when I realized something that made the situation even more terrifying. If they were blocking cell phone signals, this was planned and sophisticated. This wasn't some random incident, it was organized. We heard more activity in the main office area. Voices, the sound of papers being shuffled, and what sounded like computer keyboards being used. It was like someone had taken over the administrative center of the school. About 20 minutes into the lockdown, we heard Dr. Martinez's voice over the intercom, but something was very wrong with the way he sounded. His voice was strained and unnatural, like he was reading from a script. "Students and staff, please remain in your current locations. We are working with local authorities to resolve the situation. Do not attempt to leave the building or contact outside parties. Remain calm and follow all instructions." The message was repeated twice, and then the intercom went silent. But the way Dr. Martinez had spoken, it was clear he was being forced to make that announcement. The phrasing was wrong, and his tone was completely different from his usual confident demeanor. Marcus whispered, "That didn't sound like him at all." "Someone's making him say that," I replied quietly. We continued to hear movement and voices throughout the building. It sounded like there were multiple people involved, and they seemed to be going from room to room systematically. We could hear doors opening and closing, and occasionally muffled conversations. At one point, we heard what sounded like a large group of people being moved through the hallway. Footsteps, quiet voices, and what might have been students or teachers being escorted somewhere. The sounds moved past our door and continued toward the gymnasium area. Sarah was shaking uncontrollably, and Ashley was having trouble breathing. The stress of the situation was getting to all of us, but we knew we had to stay quiet and hidden. About an hour into the lockdown, we heard something that changed everything. Police sirens, lots of them, getting closer and closer to the school. Within minutes, we could hear vehicles pulling into the parking lot and car doors slamming. The activity in the building immediately became more frantic. We could hear running footsteps, shouting, and what sounded like equipment being moved quickly. The men who had been speaking calmly before now sounded urgent and stressed. Then we heard Dr. Martinez's voice over the intercom again, but this time he sounded more like himself. "Students and staff, law enforcement has arrived on scene. Please remain in your current locations until officers come to escort you out. Do not open doors unless you can verify that the person is a police officer." About 10 minutes later, we heard heavy footsteps in the hallway and a loud, authoritative voice calling out, "Police!" We're going room by room to escort people out safely. When they reached our door, they knocked and identified themselves as county sheriff's deputies. Jake asked them to slide their badges under the door so we could verify their identity before opening it. When we finally unlocked the door, we were greeted by 2 officers in full tactical gear. "Are all of you okay?" one of them asked. "Any injuries?" We told them we were fine, and they escorted us out of the building through a side exit. The parking lot was full of police cars, ambulances, and what looked like FBI vehicles. There were officers everywhere, and they had set up a command center near the main entrance. As we were being led to a safe area where other students and staff were gathered, I could see that several people were being loaded into ambulances. They appeared to be conscious and talking, but they were clearly shaken up. We were separated and interviewed individually by investigators. During my interview, I learned some of the details about what had actually happened. A group of 5 men had somehow gained access to the school during the day and had taken control of the main office and several key areas of the building. They weren't there to hurt anyone. They were after something specific. The investigation revealed that they were part of a sophisticated identity theft operation, and they had targeted our school because we had recently digitized all of our student records. including social security numbers, addresses, and financial aid information. The men had held several staff members, including Dr. Martinez and Mrs. Patterson, while they accessed the computer systems and downloaded massive amounts of personal data. They had also forced Dr. Martinez to make the announcements to keep everyone calm and prevent people from calling for help. What made it even more disturbing was how long they had been planning this. The investigation showed that they had been studying the school's routines for weeks. They knew when the building would have the fewest people, which staff members had access to the computer systems, and how to disable the cell phone towers in the area. The men were eventually arrested, but not before they had successfully stolen the personal information of over 800 students and their families. The school district had to provide identity monitoring services for everyone affected, and several families discovered fraudulent accounts opened in their names over the following months. For those of us who were in the building that day, the psychological impact was significant. The school brought in counselors, and many students and staff members needed ongoing therapy to deal with the trauma. What haunted me the most was the realization of how helpless we had been. 8 student leaders hiding in a conference room, completely at the mercy of people who had invaded our school. We had no way to communicate with the outside world, no way to help other people in the building, and no way to know if we were safe. The school implemented new security measures after the incident. Better access controls, panic buttons in every room, and improved communication systems. But for those of us who lived through it, the sense of security we had always felt at school was permanently damaged. I finished my senior year, but I never felt the same way about being in that building. Every unexpected announcement, every unfamiliar face in the hallway, every time I had to stay late for student council activities, it all brought back the memory of sitting in that dark conference room, listening to strangers take control of our school. The worst part was knowing that it could happen again. These weren't random criminals or disturbed individuals. They were organized professionals who had specifically targeted our school for financial gain. And if they could do it once, others could do it too. Even now, years later, I still think about that day whenever I hear about school security issues. The idea that a place where young people should feel safe and focused on learning could be violated so systematically and efficiently. It changed my perspective on a lot of things. The 8 of us stayed in touch after graduation, and we still talk about that day sometimes. We all agree that it was one of those experiences that marked a clear before and after in our lives. Before, we felt invulnerable and secure in our daily routines. After, we understood that safety is something that can be taken away in an instant by people with bad intentions and good planning. I was a junior at Riverside High School and had just landed the lead role in our spring production of Our Town. It was the biggest role I'd ever gotten, and I was determined to make the most of it. Our drama teacher, Mr. Kellerman, was known for being demanding but fair, and he'd been working with our cast for weeks to prepare for opening night. Rehearsals were held every Tuesday and Thursday after school in the auditorium, which was located in the newer wing of our school. The auditorium was beautiful. It seated about 400 people and had a full stage with professional lighting and sound equipment. During rehearsals, it was usually just our cast of 12 students, Mr. Kellerman, and sometimes Mrs. Foster, who helped with costumes and makeup. This particular Thursday in April, we were doing a full run-through of Act 2. It was about 4:30 p.m., and most of the other students had already gone home. The only people left in the building were our drama group, a few teachers grading papers in their classrooms, and the custodial staff, who started their shifts around 4 o'clock. Our cast that day included myself as George Gibbs, Jessica Martinez as Emily Webb, Senior Tom Bradley as the stage manager, and 9 other students playing various townspeople and family members. Mr. Kellerman was sitting in the front row taking notes, and Mrs. Foster was in the back, working on costume alterations. We were about halfway through the act when the lights in the auditorium suddenly went out. Not just the stage lights, all the lights, including the emergency lighting. The auditorium was plunged into complete darkness. Everyone stay where you are, Mr. Kellerman called out. Probably just a power surge. Give me a second to check the breaker panel. We could hear him moving around in the dark, using his phone's flashlight to navigate. But then we heard something that made everyone freeze. The sound of the auditorium doors slamming shut. All of them. The main entrance, the side exits, and the backstage door. The sound echoed through the space with a finality that sent chills down my spine. "Mr. Kellerman?" Jessica called out, her voice shaky. "I'm here," he replied from somewhere near the stage. "But something's wrong. The doors are locked from the outside." Tom pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. In the dim glow, we could see the rest of the cast gathered on stage, looking confused and scared. Mrs. Foster was making her way down from the back of the auditorium, using her own phone light to guide her. "The main doors won't budge," she said when she reached us. "And there's something blocking them from the outside." Mr. Kellerman tried his master key on the backstage door, but it wouldn't turn. "This doesn't make sense," he said. "These doors can't be locked from the outside during school hours. It's a fire code violation." That's when we heard the voice. It came through the auditorium's sound system, which apparently still had power even though the lights were out. A man's voice, calm and measured, speaking through the microphones. "Good afternoon, drama students. I hope you're enjoying your rehearsal." We all looked at each other in shock. The voice was coming from the sound booth at the back of the auditorium, which was supposed to be locked and accessible only to authorized personnel. "Who is that?" whispered Sarah Chen, one of the sophomore cast members. Mr. Kellerman moved toward the back of the auditorium, but the voice continued. "Please don't try to leave. The doors are secured, and you're perfectly safe as long as you follow instructions." "This is Mr. Kellerman," our teacher called out toward the sound booth. "You need to unlock these doors immediately and identify yourself." The man laughed, a sound that echoed eerily through the dark auditorium. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Kellerman. I know all of you. Jessica Martinez, honor roll student, wants to study theater at Northwestern. Tom Bradley, football player and class president. And our leading man, whose parents are both doctors and who drives a brand new Honda Civic." The fact that this person knew specific details about us was terrifying. This wasn't some random intruder. He had been watching us, studying us. "What do you want?" Mr. Kellerman demanded. "I want you to continue your rehearsal," the voice replied. "Act 2, Scene 3. Pick up where you left off." "Absolutely not," Mr. Kellerman said firmly. "We're not performing for you. Let us out of here right now." The temperature in the auditorium suddenly dropped noticeably. We could hear the air conditioning system kicking into overdrive, pumping cold air into the space. "You'll find that I control more than just the doors and lights," the voice said. "The temperature, the ventilation, even the fire suppression system. I suggest you cooperate." Mrs. Foster had been trying to call 911 on her cell phone, but she shook her head in frustration. "No signal," she whispered to Mr. Kellerman. "Cell phone jammers," the voice explained, apparently having heard her. "Very effective for maintaining privacy during performances." The situation was becoming more surreal and frightening by the minute. We were trapped in a dark, increasingly cold auditorium, with someone who had complete control over the building's systems and knew personal details about each of us. "Why are you doing this?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I appreciate good theater," the man replied, "and because I've been watching your rehearsals for weeks. You're quite talented, but you lack intensity. Real emotion. I'm here to help you find that." Tom stepped forward, trying to project confidence despite the situation. "Look, whoever you are, this is kidnapping. You're going to be in serious trouble when the police find out." "The police won't be finding out anytime soon," the voice said. "The building's security system shows everything is normal. The doors are locked for after-hours access, the lights are off to save energy, and there's no indication of any problems." Mr. Kellerman was moving around the auditorium, trying different exits and looking for any way out. but every door was sealed tight, and the windows were too high and too small to be viable escape routes. Now, the voice continued, let's begin again. Act 2, Scene 3. And this time, I want to see real fear, real desperation. Because that's what you're feeling right now, isn't it? The cast looked at each other uncertainly. None of us wanted to perform for this person, but we were also starting to realize how completely trapped we were. We're not doing this, Mr. Kellerman said firmly. Whatever sick game you're playing, we won't be part of it. The air conditioning kicked up another notch, and the temperature dropped even further. We could see our breath in the beam of the phone flashlights. You have 15 minutes to begin the scene, the voice said. After that, I'll start making things more uncomfortable. Mrs. Foster was shivering, and some of the younger students were starting to cry. The psychological pressure of being trapped with someone who clearly had extensive control over our environment was overwhelming. What happens if we perform? Jessica asked quietly. Then you give the performance of your lives, the voice replied. And afterward, we'll see how you handle the final act. Mr. Kellerman gathered us in a huddle on stage. We need to find a way out of here, he whispered. This person is clearly unstable, and I don't trust what they might do. But what if we can't get out? Sarah whispered back. What if playing along is the only way to stay safe? It was an impossible choice. Refuse to perform and risk whatever escalation this person had planned, or give in to their demands and potentially encourage more dangerous behavior. Tom made the decision for us. We'll do the scene, he announced loudly, but then you let us go. Excellent, the voice replied. Places, everyone. And remember, I want to see real emotion. We took our positions for Act 2, Scene 3, which was one of the most emotional scenes in the play. It deals with death and loss, themes that felt horrifyingly appropriate given our situation. As we began the scene, something strange happened. The fear and desperation we were feeling in real life began to bleed into our performances. Jessica's portrayal of Emily's anguish was more powerful than it had ever been. Tom's narration as the stage manager carried a weight and gravitas that had been missing in previous rehearsals. Beautiful, the voice said during a pause in the dialogue. This is what I wanted to see. Real human emotion, not the sanitized version you've been giving me. We continued through the scene, and I found myself delivering lines with an intensity I'd never achieved before. The terror of our situation was somehow translating into the most authentic performance I'd ever given. When we finished the scene, there was silence in the auditorium. Then slow, deliberate clapping from the sound booth. Magnificent, the voice said. That was worth waiting for. Now let us go, Mr. Kellerman demanded. Not quite yet, the voice replied. One more scene, the final scene of the play, and then we'll discuss your release. But before we could respond, we heard something that changed everything. Sirens outside the building. Multiple sirens getting closer. It seems our time together is being cut short, the voice said. And for the first time, he sounded less confident. The lights in the auditorium suddenly came back on, temporarily blinding us after being in darkness for so long. We could hear mechanical sounds as the door locks disengaged. Remember this performance, the voice said. Remember what real emotion feels like on stage. Mr. Kellerman immediately ran to the main doors and found that they opened easily. Mrs. Foster was already calling 911 on her phone, which now had full signal strength. Within minutes, the auditorium was filled with police officers and paramedics. They found the sound booth empty, but there was evidence that someone had been there. Computer equipment, surveillance monitors showing feeds from cameras throughout the school, and detailed files on each member of our drama program. The investigation revealed that the intruder had been a former drama teacher who had been fired from another school district for inappropriate behavior with students. he had somehow gained access to our school's building management system and had been watching our rehearsals for weeks through hidden cameras. He was never caught. By the time the police arrived, he had escaped through a maintenance tunnel that connected to the building's basement. The tunnel led to a storm drain system that allowed him to exit several blocks away without being detected. The school installed new security measures and swept the building for hidden cameras, finding 3 more that had been recording activities in other areas. The drama program was suspended for the rest of the semester while the investigation continued. For those of us who were in the auditorium that day, the experience was traumatic in ways that were hard to explain. We had been forced to perform under duress, to use our fear and vulnerability as entertainment for someone who had violated our safety and privacy. But there was also something disturbing about how good our performance had been. The terror we felt had translated into the most authentic acting any of us had ever done. It raised uncomfortable questions about the relationship between real emotion and artistic expression. I never performed in another school play. The idea of being on stage, vulnerable and exposed, brought back too many memories of that afternoon. Several other cast members had similar reactions, and our drama program never fully recovered. Mr. Kellerman left teaching at the end of that school year. He told me later that he couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed to protect us, that his job was to create a safe space for artistic expression, and he had been unable to do that when it mattered most. The man who trapped us was never identified or caught, despite an extensive investigation. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, watching other drama programs, waiting for another opportunity to force the young actors to find real emotion through fear and manipulation. The experience taught me that art and creativity require trust and safety to flourish. When those are taken away, when performance becomes coercion, something essential is lost. Even if the resulting work is technically better, it comes at a cost that no artist should have to pay. I was a sophomore at Eastwood High School and had signed up for an advanced computer programming class that met during 7th period. It was an elective that only about 15 students took, mostly juniors and seniors who were serious about technology. Our teacher, Mr. Davidson, was a former software engineer who had switched to teaching after working in Silicon Valley for 10 years. The computer lab was located in the basement of the school, in what used to be a fallout shelter built during the Cold War. The school had converted it into a technology center in the late 1990s, but it still had that bunker-like feel. Thick concrete walls, no windows, and only one entrance. The lab had 20 high-end computers arranged in 4 rows, with Mr. Davidson's desk and a projector screen at the front. This particular Friday in November, we were working on our final projects for the semester. I was building a simple video game, while other students were creating websites, databases, or mobile apps. It was the kind of class where everyone worked at their own pace, and Mr. Davidson would circulate around the room helping individuals with their code. There were 12 of us in class that day. Myself, seniors Alex Chen and Maria Santos, juniors Kevin Park, Lisa Rodriguez, and Danny Walsh, and 6 other underclassmen. Mr. Davidson had stepped out around 2:45 p.m. to make copies in the main office, leaving us to work independently. This wasn't unusual. He trusted us to stay focused without supervision. I was debugging a particularly frustrating piece of code when the lights went out. Not just dimmed, completely out. The computer lab was plunged into absolute darkness. All the computer screens went black simultaneously, and even the emergency lighting failed to come on. "What the hell?" Alex said from somewhere across the room. "Must be a power outage," Maria replied. "But why didn't the backup generators kick in?" We all started pulling out our phones to use as flashlights, but that's when we discovered something alarming. None of our phones had any signal. Not just weak signal, but completely dead. No bars, no data, nothing. "That's weird," Kevin said. "My phone was working fine 5 minutes ago." Danny tried the door to see if we could get out and find Mr. Davidson, but when he turned the handle, nothing happened. "It's locked," he said, rattling the door. "But it doesn't lock from the outside. There's no keyhole or anything." Lisa walked over to help him, and together they tried pushing and pulling on the door, but it wouldn't budge. "It's like it's sealed shut," she said. That's when we heard the voice. It came from speakers mounted in the ceiling. Speakers that were normally used for morning announcements, but had never been active in the computer lab before. "Good afternoon, programming students. I hope you're enjoying your lesson in system vulnerabilities." The voice was electronically distorted, like someone was using a voice modulator. It sounded neither male nor female, just artificial and unsettling. "Who is that?" Maria called out toward the ceiling. "Someone who's been watching your progress with great interest," the voice replied. "You're all so focused on writing code, but you've never considered how that code might be used against you." Alex was trying to restart one of the computers, but nothing happened when he pressed the power button. "All the machines are completely dead," he said. "Of course they are," the voice continued. "I've taken control of the building's electrical systems, the network infrastructure, and the security protocols. You're experiencing a real-world demonstration of what happens when someone with superior technical skills decides to exploit system weaknesses." The temperature in the room began to drop noticeably. We could hear the ventilation system working, but instead of circulating warm air, it was pumping in cold air from outside. "This is kidnapping," Danny said loudly. "You can't just trap us in here." "Can I?" the voice replied with what sounded like amusement. "I've already done it. The door is controlled by an electronic lock that I've overridden. The power grid for this section of the building is under my control. Your cell phones are being jammed by equipment I installed weeks ago. From a technical standpoint, this is quite elegant." Kevin was examining the door more closely, with his phone's flashlight. "There's some kind of electronic device attached to the lock mechanism," he said. "It looks like it was installed recently." "Very observant," the voice said. "That's a custom-built override system. I've been planning this demonstration for quite some time." Lisa was starting to panic. "What do you want from us? Why are you doing this?" "I want to teach you something that your curriculum doesn't cover," the voice explained. "You're learning to write programs and build systems, but you're not learning to think like attackers. You're not considering how your creations might be turned against innocent people." The cold was becoming more intense, and we were all starting to shiver. Some of the younger students were beginning to cry quietly. "Each of you has been working on projects that demonstrate various programming concepts," the voice continued. "But what you don't realize is that every system you build creates potential vulnerabilities. Every line of code you write could be exploited by someone with malicious intent." Alex was trying to find some way to communicate with the outside world. "There has to be an emergency phone or something," he said, searching around Mr. Davidson's desk. "The emergency communication system has been disabled," the voice informed him, "along with the fire alarm, the security cameras, and the building's central monitoring system. As far as the outside world knows, everything in this room is functioning normally." Maria was examining the ventilation grates, trying to see if there was any way to escape through the air ducts, but the grates were secured with screws, and we didn't have any tools to remove them. "Now," the voice said, "let's begin your real education. I'm going to show you exactly how vulnerable your digital lives really are." The projector screen at the front of the room suddenly lit up, displaying what appeared to be personal information about each of us. Social media profiles, email accounts, text message conversations, browsing histories, intimate details of our online lives that should have been private. "This is all information I gathered from your devices and accounts over the past month," the voice explained. "Your passwords were laughably easy to crack. Your privacy settings were inadequate. Your digital footprints led me directly to your most personal information." We stared at the screen in horror as our private conversations, photos, and personal details were displayed for everyone to see. It was a violation that felt almost physical in its intensity. "This is illegal," Kevin said, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "So, is hacking into government systems, stealing corporate data, and launching cyber attacks the voice replied. But it happens thousands of times every day, because people like you build systems without considering how they might be misused. Danny was trying to cover the younger student's eyes as more personal information appeared on the screen. "Stop this," he pleaded. "They're just kids." "They're future programmers," the voice corrected. "And if they don't learn these lessons now, they'll create systems that put millions of people at risk." The temperature continued to drop, and we were all huddled together for warmth. The psychological pressure of having our private lives exposed, combined with the physical discomfort, was becoming overwhelming. "What do you want us to do?" I asked, speaking up for the first time. "I want you to understand," the voice said. "I want you to realize that every system can be compromised, every network can be penetrated, and every device can be turned against its user. I want you to think like attackers so you can build better defenses." Alex was working on something at one of the computer terminals, trying to get it to respond. "If you're such a great hacker," he called out, "why don't you teach us properly instead of terrorizing us?" "Because fear is the most effective teacher," the voice replied. "You'll remember this lesson for the rest of your lives. Every time you write code, you'll think about security. Every time you design a system, you'll consider how it might be exploited." That's when we heard something that gave us hope. Footsteps in the hallway outside. Heavy, purposeful footsteps that sounded like they belonged to multiple people. "It seems our lesson is about to be interrupted," the voice said, and for the first time there was a note of concern in the electronic tone. The light suddenly came back on, temporarily blinding us after being in darkness for so long. The computers began booting up, and we could hear the electronic lock on the door disengaging. Mr. Davidson burst through the door, followed by 2 security guards and a police officer. "Is everyone okay?" he asked, looking around the room frantically. "We're fine," Maria said, "but someone's been holding us here and showing us our private information." The projector screen was now blank, and our phones were showing full signal strength again. Whatever equipment had been jamming our communications had been turned off or removed. The investigation that followed revealed the extent of the intrusion. The person responsible had indeed installed sophisticated equipment throughout the school's network infrastructure. They had been monitoring our online activities for weeks, gathering personal information and studying our digital habits. Most disturbing was the discovery that this wasn't the first time. Similar incidents had occurred at 3 other schools in different states over the past year. In each case, computer science students had been trapped and subjected to demonstrations of their digital vulnerability. The perpetrator was eventually identified as a former cybersecurity consultant who had become obsessed with what he saw as the inadequate security education in schools. He believed that young programmers were being taught to build systems without understanding how those systems could be attacked. He was arrested 6 months later when he attempted a similar demonstration at a university in another state. During his trial, it came out that he had been motivated by a cyber attack on his own company that had been carried out by recent computer science graduates who used techniques they had learned in school for malicious purposes. The experience changed how I thought about programming and technology. The violation of having my private information displayed and analyzed was something that stayed with me long after the physical fear had faded. Our school completely overhauled its computer science curriculum to include extensive coverage of cybersecurity and ethical hacking. Mr. Davidson, who felt responsible for what had happened, became one of the leading advocates for security education in high schools. For those of us who were in that lab, the incident served as a harsh introduction to the darker side of technology. We learned that the skills we were developing could be used to help people or to harm them, and that the choice of how to use those skills would define our careers and our character. The man who trapped us was sentenced to 8 years in prison, but the questions he raised about security education and ethical responsibility in technology remained relevant. His methods were criminal and traumatic, but his core message about the need for better security awareness wasn't entirely wrong. I went on to study cybersecurity in college, partly because of that experience. I wanted to understand how to build systems that couldn't be easily compromised, and how to protect people from the kind of violation we had experienced. But I also learned that security isn't just about technical measures. It's about understanding human psychology, social engineering, and the ways that fear and vulnerability can be exploited. The most sophisticated security system in the world is useless if the people using it can be manipulated or coerced. That lesson, taught in the most traumatic way possible, shaped my entire approach to technology and security. Every system I've worked on since then has been designed with the assumption that someone, somewhere, is trying to break it. And every time I write code, I think about that voice in the darkness, reminding me that every line of code creates both possibilities and vulnerabilities. I was a senior at Westfield Academy and captain of our debate team. We were one of the top-ranked teams in the state, and I'd been competing in forensics since my freshman year. Our coach, Mrs. Chen, was a former prosecutor who had turned to teaching, and she ran our program with military precision. This particular Saturday in February, we were hosting the regional qualifying tournament at our school. Teams from 12 different high schools had come to compete, with the top 3 finishers advancing to the state championship. Our school's debate tournaments were always well-organized events that drew some of the best young speakers in the region. The tournament was being held in our school's academic wing, which had been specifically designed for events like this. There were 8 classrooms that could serve as debate rounds, a large commons area for registration and breaks, and a lecture hall where the final rounds would take place. About 60 students were participating, along with their coaches and volunteer judges. I was competing in Lincoln Douglas debate, which is a one-on-one format focused on philosophical and ethical questions. My first 3 rounds had gone well, and I was feeling confident about making it to the elimination rounds that afternoon. It was around 11:30 a.m., and we were between rounds 3 and 4. Most of the competitors were in the commons area, reviewing their notes, eating snacks, or talking strategy with their coaches. The atmosphere was tense, but excited. This was the kind of high-stakes competition that serious debaters lived for. I was sitting with my teammate Rachel, who competed in public forum debate, when we heard an announcement over the school's PA system. But instead of the tournament director's voice, it was someone we didn't recognize. A man speaking in a calm, measured tone. "Attention debate tournament participants. The building is now under lockdown. Please remain in your current locations and await further instructions." Everyone in the commons area looked around confused. Mrs. Chen immediately went to find the tournament director, Mr. Peterson, who was supposed to be coordinating with school security. But when she came back a few minutes later, her face was pale. "I can't find Mr. Peterson anywhere," she said quietly to the other coaches. "And the main office is locked. No one's answering." That's when we noticed that the exterior doors to the academic wing had been secured. Students who tried to leave for bathroom breaks or to get something from their cars found that the doors wouldn't open. The electronic locks that were normally controlled from the main office had been activated. "This has to be some kind of mistake," said Coach Williams from Riverside High. "Maybe there's a security drill we weren't told about." But Mrs. Chen was already on her phone, trying to call the school's main number. "It's going straight to voicemail," she said. "Something's not right." The voice came over the PA system again, and this time the tone was different, more authoritative and slightly menacing. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are participating in a very special kind of debate tournament today. One where the stakes are considerably higher than a trophy or a qualification to state championships." Rachel grabbed my arm. "What is he talking about?" Around the commons area, coaches were trying to use their cell phones, but several of them were shaking their heads in frustration. "No signal," Coach Martinez from Central High announced. "My phone was working fine 10 minutes ago." "Your communication devices have been temporarily disabled," the voice explained, as if he had heard the conversation. "This is to ensure that our debate proceeds without outside interference." Mrs. Chen stood up and addressed the voice directly. "Who are you? What do you want from us? I am someone who appreciates the art of argumentation, the voice replied. And I have a proposition for all of you, a debate topic that will test not just your rhetorical skills, but your moral courage. The temperature in the building began to change. We could hear the HVAC system working overtime, but instead of maintaining a comfortable environment, it was getting noticeably warmer. Within minutes, the commons area felt stuffy and uncomfortable. The resolution for today's special debate is as follows. The voice continued, resolved. When faced with an impossible choice, it is morally justifiable to sacrifice the few to save the many. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. This wasn't a normal debate topic, it was the kind of ethical dilemma that philosophers had wrestled with for centuries. But it was being presented in a context that felt threatening and real. I don't understand, called out Jeremy, a junior from Northside Academy. What kind of choice are you talking about? An excellent question, the voice replied. Let me clarify the parameters of our debate. You are all trapped in this building. The doors are sealed, your communications are blocked, and the environmental controls are under my command. Your release depends on your ability to engage with this moral question in a meaningful way. Coach Williams stood up angrily. This is kidnapping. You can't hold students hostage for some twisted philosophical exercise. Can't I? The voice asked. I already have. The question now is whether you'll participate constructively in the discussion, or whether you'll force me to make the moral dilemma more concrete. The air conditioning system shifted again, and the temperature began to drop rapidly. Within minutes, we went from uncomfortably warm to uncomfortably cold. Students started putting on jackets and huddling together for warmth. This is insane, Rachel whispered to me. What does he want us to do? Mrs. Chen was trying to maintain order among the increasingly frightened students. Everyone stay calm, she said. We need to think this through logically. Exactly right, the voice said approvingly. Logic and reason are the tools we use to navigate moral complexity. So let's begin our debate. I want to hear arguments from both sides of the resolution. We're not debating anything with you, Mrs. Chen said firmly. Release these students immediately. The lights in the commons area suddenly dimmed to about half their normal brightness. I'm afraid that's not an option, the voice replied. You see, this building's environmental systems are now under my complete control. Temperature, lighting, air circulation, even the fire suppression system. Your comfort and safety depend on your willingness to engage with the philosophical question I've posed. A sophomore from Valley High started crying. The psychological pressure of being trapped with someone who clearly had extensive control over our environment was overwhelming, especially for the younger students. Okay, I said, standing up. I'll debate the topic, but only if you promise that everyone here stays safe. An admirable display of leadership, the voice said. Very well, present your opening argument. I looked around at the frightened faces of my fellow competitors. These were some of the brightest students in the region, people who had dedicated years to the art of argumentation and critical thinking. If anyone could navigate this situation, it was us. The resolution assumes that we can accurately predict outcomes and assign moral value to different lives. I began, falling back on my debate training. But in reality, we rarely have perfect information about the consequences of our choices. The utilitarian calculus that the resolution implies is based on flawed assumptions about our ability to measure and compare human worth. Interesting, the voice replied. But you're avoiding the central question. If you knew with certainty that sacrificing one person would save 10 others, wouldn't you have a moral obligation to make that choice? Rachel stood up beside me. That's a false dichotomy, she said. It assumes that those are the only two options available. In real-world situations, there are almost always alternative solutions that don't require sacrificing anyone. But what if there aren't? The voice pressed. What if the choice is truly binary? 1 dies or 10 die? What then? The debate continued for over an hour, with students and coaches taking turns presenting arguments. It was surreal. We were engaged in a high-level philosophical discussion, while being held captive by someone who seemed to view our situation as a real-world test case for the moral principles we were debating. The environmental controls continued to fluctuate. Sometimes it was too hot, sometimes too cold. Sometimes the lights would dim or brighten unpredictably. It was clear that our captor was using these changes to maintain psychological pressure and demonstrate his control over our situation. "You're all very articulate," the voice said after a particularly heated exchange about the nature of moral duty. "But I wonder how your arguments would change if the stakes were more personal." That's when the lights went out completely, plunging the commons area into darkness. We could hear mechanical sounds from somewhere in the building, doors opening and closing, systems activating and deactivating. "I've just sealed off the ventilation system," the voice announced. "You now have approximately 4 hours of breathable air remaining in this space. The question is no longer theoretical, it's immediate and practical." Panic began to set in among the students. Some were crying, others were trying to find ways to break down the doors or windows. The coaches were attempting to maintain order, but the situation had moved beyond anything they were trained to handle. "This is what I wanted you to understand," the voice continued. "Moral philosophy isn't just an academic exercise. It's about real choices that real people have to make under pressure. When your own survival is at stake, how do your ethical principles hold up?" Mrs. Chen was trying to organize the students into groups to search for alternative exits or ways to communicate with the outside world. But every option we explored had been anticipated and blocked. "There's one way to restore the ventilation," the voice said, "but it requires a volunteer. Someone willing to enter the mechanical room and manually reset the system. The catch is that the room is designed to lock automatically once someone enters, and the reset process releases a significant amount of toxic gas. Whoever volunteers won't survive." The commons area fell silent except for the sound of people breathing heavily in the increasingly stale air. The moral dilemma that had been theoretical was now horrifyingly real. "So," the voice said, "who among you is willing to sacrifice themselves to save the others? Who will put their philosophical principles into practice?" That's when we heard something that changed everything. Sirens outside the building. Multiple sirens getting closer and closer. "It appears our philosophical discussion is about to be interrupted," the voice said, and for the first time he sounded less confident. The lights came back on, and we could hear the ventilation system resuming normal operation. The electronic locks on the doors disengaged with audible clicks. "Remember this lesson," the voice said, as police officers began entering the building. "Remember that moral philosophy matters most when the stakes are highest. And remember that the choices you make in crisis situations reveal who you really are." The investigation revealed that our captor was a former philosophy professor who had been dismissed from his university position for conducting unethical psychological experiments on his students. He had become obsessed with testing moral theories in real-world situations. He had spent months planning the attack on our tournament, studying the building's systems, and installing equipment to control the environmental controls and communications. His goal was to create a situation where students would be forced to confront the practical implications of the ethical theories they debated. The professor was arrested and eventually sentenced to 20 years in prison. But the questions he had raised about the relationship between moral philosophy and real-world decision-making continued to haunt those of us who had been there. Several students quit debate after the incident, unable to engage with philosophical arguments without remembering the fear and pressure of that day. Others, like myself, became more interested in applied ethics and the ways that moral principles translate into practical action. The experience taught me that intellectual exercises and real-world moral choices are fundamentally different. It's easy to debate abstract principles when you're safe and comfortable. It's much harder to maintain those principles when your own survival or the survival of people you care about is at stake. I went on to study philosophy and law in college, partly because of that experience. I wanted to understand how moral reasoning works under pressure and how we can prepare ourselves to make ethical choices in crisis situations. But I also learned that some questions don't have clean answers, and that the people who claim to have simple solutions to complex moral problems are often the most dangerous. The professor who trapped us believed he was teaching us something important, but his methods revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how moral education actually works. True ethical development doesn't come from manufactured crises or forced choices. It comes from careful reflection, open dialogue, and the gradual development of moral intuitions through experience and practice. The fear and coercion we experienced that day didn't make us better moral reasoners. It just made us more aware of how vulnerable we all are when someone with power decides to use it against us. I was a junior at Millfield High School and had been working on my science fair project for months. It was a study of electromagnetic interference patterns, and I was hoping to place well enough to qualify for the state competition. Our school's science fair was always a big event, drawing participants from all grade levels and attracting judges from local universities and research institutions. The fair was being held on a Saturday in March in our school's gymnasium and adjoining science wing. About 40 students had projects on display, ranging from simple demonstrations by freshmen to sophisticated research projects by seniors, hoping to catch the attention of college admissions officers. I had arrived early that morning to set up my display board and equipment. My project required several electronic devices that needed to be calibrated before the judging began at 10 a.m. The gymnasium was buzzing with activity as students arranged their presentations and tested their demonstrations. My best friend Marcus was there with his chemistry project on catalytic reactions, and my girlfriend Sarah had entered a biology project studying bacterial resistance patterns. We had all been working together in the school's lab after hours for weeks, helping each other troubleshoot problems and refine our presentations. The judging was scheduled to run from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., with awards being announced at 3 p.m. Parents, teachers, and community members were invited to view the projects during the afternoon session. It was always one of the highlights of our school's academic calendar. Around 9:45 a.m., just as the judges were arriving and students were making final adjustments to their displays, the fire alarm went off. But instead of the usual steady tone, it was an intermittent pattern that we'd never heard before. "That's not the fire alarm," said Mrs. Patterson, our chemistry teacher, who was coordinating the event. "That's the lockdown signal." Everyone in the gymnasium looked around confused. Lockdown drills were never scheduled during special events, and there had been no announcement about any kind of emergency. Mrs. Patterson went to check with the main office, but when she tried to leave the gymnasium, she found that the doors wouldn't open. The electronic locks that were normally controlled from the security office had been activated. "The doors are sealed," she announced to the room. "Everyone stay calm while I try to figure out what's happening." That's when we noticed that our cell phones weren't working. Not just poor signal, completely dead. No bars, no data, nothing. Several students tried calling their parents to let them know about the situation, but none of the calls would go through. "Ladies and gentlemen," came a voice over the gymnasium's PA system. It was a man's voice, calm and professional, but not one that any of us recognized. "Welcome to a very special kind of science fair. One where you'll be demonstrating principles that aren't typically covered in your textbooks." Mrs. Patterson looked up at the speakers mounted on the gymnasium walls. "Who is this? Identify yourself immediately." "I am someone who appreciates scientific inquiry," the voice replied, "and I have a hypothesis that I'd like to test using the resources available in this room." The temperature in the gymnasium began to change. We could hear the HVAC system working, but instead of maintaining the usual comfortable environment, it was getting noticeably warmer. Within minutes, the large space felt stuffy and oppressive. "The hypothesis is this," the voice continued. "When faced with a survival scenario, will a group of intelligent young people use scientific reasoning to solve problems, or will they revert to panic and irrational behavior?" Marcus was trying to restart his phone. but it remained completely unresponsive. "This is insane," he said quietly. "Someone's jamming all the communications." "Very observant," the voice said, apparently having heard him. "Yes, I've installed signal jammers throughout the building. I've also taken control of the environmental systems, the security protocols, and the building's power grid. You are now subjects in a controlled experiment." Sarah was examining the door locks more closely. "These aren't just electronic locks," she said. "Someone's installed additional hardware, custom-built override systems." "Excellent analysis," the voice replied approvingly. "You're beginning to think like scientists. Observation, hypothesis formation, testing. These are the skills you'll need to survive the next few hours." The lights in the gymnasium dimmed to about half their normal brightness, and the temperature continued to rise. Several of the younger students were starting to look scared, and some of the parents who had arrived early for the viewing session were demanding answers that none of us could provide. "What do you want from us?" called out Jennifer, a senior with a physics project on wave mechanics. "I want you to solve a problem," the voice explained. "The building's life support systems are now operating on backup power. You have approximately 6 hours of breathable air remaining. The temperature will continue to rise until it reaches dangerous levels. Your task is to use the scientific equipment and knowledge available in this room to restore normal environmental controls." Mrs. Patterson was trying to maintain order among the increasingly frightened students and parents. "This is kidnapping," she said loudly. "You're holding minors against their will." "I'm conducting a research study," the voice corrected. "One that will test whether academic knowledge can be applied to real-world survival situations. The results should be quite illuminating." The situation was becoming more surreal and frightening by the minute. We were trapped in a gymnasium with our science fair projects, being forced to participate in some kind of twisted experiment by someone who had clearly spent considerable time planning this scenario. "There are clues hidden throughout your project displays," the voice continued. "Information that, when properly analyzed and combined, will lead you to the solution. But you'll need to work together, share resources, and think creatively." I looked around at the 40 science projects scattered throughout the gymnasium. Chemistry demonstrations, physics experiments, biology displays, computer programming projects. It was like a miniature laboratory filled with equipment and materials. "This is what I wanted you to understand," the voice said. "Science isn't just about memorizing facts or following procedures. It's about problem solving under pressure, collaboration, and the application of knowledge to unexpected challenges." Marcus was already moving between the different project displays, looking for anything that might be relevant to our situation. "If this is real," he said quietly, "then we need to treat it like a real problem. What do we know about building systems? Environmental controls? Emergency protocols?" Sarah joined him, and soon several other students were systematically examining the projects for useful equipment or information. It was remarkable how quickly the group shifted from panic to focused problem solving. "The chemistry projects might have materials we can use," suggested David, a senior with an environmental science project. "And the physics demonstrations could help us understand the building's electrical systems." The temperature continued to rise, and we were all starting to sweat. The psychological pressure of being trapped with someone who clearly had extensive technical knowledge and control over our environment was overwhelming. "Look at this," Jennifer called out from her physics display. "I've got equipment for measuring electromagnetic fields. If someone's installed jamming devices, we might be able to locate them." "And I've got materials for chemical analysis," Marcus added. "If we can figure out what's in the air circulation system, we might be able to neutralize it." The collaboration that emerged was unlike anything I'd ever seen in a classroom setting. Students who barely knew each other were sharing equipment, combining their knowledge, and working together with an intensity born of genuine necessity. The computer programming projects might be key, Sarah realized. If the building systems are controlled electronically, maybe we can hack into them. Alex, a sophomore with a coding project, was already trying to access the building's network through his laptop. "I'm getting some kind of signal," he said, "but it's heavily encrypted." The voice came over the PA system again. "Impressive progress. You're beginning to understand that scientific knowledge is most valuable when it's applied collaboratively to solve real problems." But as we worked, the conditions in the gymnasium continued to deteriorate. The temperature was now uncomfortably high, and the air was becoming noticeably stale. Several of the younger students were showing signs of heat exhaustion. "We need to work faster," Mrs. Patterson said, helping to coordinate the different groups. "Whatever this person's agenda is, the physical danger is real." That's when we made a breakthrough. By combining Jennifer's electromagnetic field measurements with Alex's network analysis and Marcus's chemical testing, we discovered that the jamming equipment was located in the building's mechanical room, and that the environmental controls were being overridden by a sophisticated computer system. "The solution requires someone to physically access the mechanical room," Alex announced after analyzing the building's network architecture. "But the room is designed to lock automatically once someone enters, and the override process involves exposure to potentially dangerous chemicals." The gymnasium fell silent as the implications sank in. The voice had created a scenario where solving the problem required someone to take a significant personal risk. "So," the voice said, "who among you is willing to apply their scientific knowledge in a situation where the stakes are personal? Who will put their education to the ultimate test?" That's when we heard something that changed everything. The sound of helicopters outside the building. Multiple helicopters, getting closer and closer. "It appears our experiment is about to be terminated," the voice said, and for the first time, he sounded less confident. The lights came back to full brightness, and we could hear the HVAC system resuming normal operation. The electronic locks on the doors disengaged with audible clicks. "Remember this lesson," the voice said, as we heard police officers entering the building. "Remember that scientific knowledge is only valuable when it can be applied to solve real problems. And remember that the greatest discoveries often require collaboration and courage." The investigation revealed that our captor was a former research scientist who had been dismissed from a government laboratory for conducting unauthorized experiments on human subjects. He had become obsessed with testing whether academic education actually prepared students for real-world problem solving. He had spent months studying our school's science program and installing sophisticated equipment to control the building's systems. His goal was to create a situation where students would be forced to apply their scientific knowledge in a high-stakes survival scenario. The scientist was arrested and eventually sentenced to 15 years in prison. But the questions he had raised about the relationship between academic learning and practical application continued to resonate with those of us who had been there. Several students changed their career plans after the incident, moving toward fields like emergency management, crisis response, or applied research. Others, like myself, became more interested in the ethical implications of scientific research and the responsibilities that come with technical knowledge. The experience taught me that scientific education isn't just about understanding concepts or conducting experiments in controlled environments. It's about developing the ability to think critically under pressure, to collaborate effectively with others, and to apply knowledge creatively to unexpected challenges. But I also learned that some people use their scientific knowledge for harmful purposes, and that the same skills that can be used to solve problems can also be used to create them. The scientist who trapped us believed he was conducting valuable research, but his methods revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how learning actually works. True scientific education doesn't come from manufactured crises or forced applications. It comes from careful study, open inquiry, and the gradual development of problem-solving skills through practice and collaboration. The fear and coercion we experienced that day didn't make us better scientists. It just made us more aware of how scientific knowledge can be weaponized by those who lack ethical constraints. I went on to study engineering and ethics in college, partly because of that experience. I wanted to understand how to use technical knowledge responsibly and how to ensure that scientific advancement serves human welfare rather than individual power. The science fair that day taught me more about collaboration, problem solving, and the application of knowledge than any classroom experience ever had. But it also taught me that the context in which learning occurs matters enormously, and that education should empower students rather than exploit their vulnerability. The school newspaper. I was a senior at Riverside High School and editor-in-chief of our school newspaper, the Riverside Review. It was a position I'd worked towards since freshman year, starting as a staff writer and gradually taking on more responsibility. Our newspaper was published monthly and covered everything from sports and academics to student life and local community issues. This particular Tuesday evening in January, our editorial staff was staying late to finalize the February issue. We had a deadline to meet for the printing company, and several articles still needed final edits and fact-checking. The newspaper office was located in the basement of the school's media center, a converted storage room that we'd transformed into a functional newsroom over the years. Our staff that night consisted of 6 people: myself as editor-in-chief, deputy editors Amanda Walsh, sports editor Tyler Kim, features writer Jessica Parks, photographer Ben Rodriguez, and freshman staff writer Katie Chen. We often worked late on production nights, and the custodial staff was used to seeing us there after hours. The newspaper office was cramped but functional, with 6 desks arranged around the room, a layout table for designing pages, and walls covered with past issues, journalism awards, and photos from school events. There was only one entrance, a heavy door that led to a narrow hallway connecting to the main basement corridor. We'd been working for about 2 hours when the building's lights flickered and then went out completely. Not just dimmed, total darkness. The computers shut down, and even the emergency lighting failed to activate. "Power outage," Tyler said, pulling out his phone to use as a flashlight. Probably just a blown transformer or something. But when we tried to use our phones to call the main office or our parents, we discovered that none of them had any signal. Not weak signal, completely dead. No bars, no data, nothing. "That's weird," Amanda said. "My phone was working fine 10 minutes ago." Ben tried the door to see if we could get upstairs and find a custodian or security guard. But when he turned the handle, nothing happened. "It's locked," he said, rattling the door. "But this door doesn't have a lock. It's just a regular interior door." Jessica joined him, and together they tried pushing and pulling, but the door wouldn't budge. "It's like something's blocking it from the outside," she said. That's when we heard the voice. It came from speakers we didn't even know existed in our office. Speakers that must have been installed recently because they'd never been active before. "Good evening, journalists. I hope you're ready for the story of a lifetime." The voice was electronically distorted, making it impossible to determine if it was male or female, young or old. It sounded artificial and unsettling. "Who is that?" Amanda called out toward the ceiling. "Someone who's been following your work with great interest," the voice replied. "You write about school events, sports scores, and student achievements. But you've never covered a real story. Tonight, that changes." Katie, our freshman writer, was starting to panic. "What's happening? Why can't we get out?" "Because you're about to become participants in the story instead of just observers," the voice explained. "You're going to learn what real journalism looks like when the stakes are personal." The temperature in the small office began to drop noticeably. We could hear the ventilation system working, but instead of circulating warm air, it was pumping in cold air from outside. "This is kidnapping," I said loudly. "You can't just trap us in here." "Can I?" the voice replied, with what sounded like amusement. "I've already done it. The door is secured with a custom electronic lock. Your communications are being jammed. The building's environmental systems are under my control. From a journalistic standpoint, this is quite a scoop." Tyler was examining the door more closely with his phone's flashlight. "There's some kind of device attached to the door frame," he said. It looks like it was installed recently." "Very observant," the voice said. "That's the kind of attention to detail that makes good journalism. But observation is only the first step. Real reporters dig deeper." The cold was becoming more intense, and we were all starting to shiver. The psychological pressure of being trapped in a small space with someone who clearly had extensive control over our environment was overwhelming. "What do you want from us?" Jessica asked. "I want you to investigate a story," the voice explained. "A story that your school administration has been trying to cover up for months. A story that involves corruption, fraud, and the misuse of public funds." Amanda was trying to restart one of the computers, but nothing happened when she pressed the power button. "All the equipment is dead," she said. "Traditional tools won't help you with this investigation," the voice continued. "You'll need to rely on your journalistic instincts, your ability to ask the right questions, and your willingness to pursue the truth even when it's uncomfortable." Ben was searching through the filing cabinets in our office, looking for anything that might be relevant. "What kind of story are you talking about? What corruption?" "Excellent question," the voice replied approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of inquiry that drives real journalism. The story involves your beloved principal, Dr. Harrison, and his creative approach to managing the school's budget." The temperature continued to drop, and we were all huddling together for warmth. The small office felt like a refrigerator, and our breath was becoming visible in the beam of our phone flashlights. "Dr. Harrison has been embezzling funds from the school's activity accounts," the voice continued. "Money that was supposed to go to student programs, sports teams, and academic resources has been diverted to his personal accounts. The evidence is hidden throughout this building, but it requires real investigative work to uncover it." Katie was crying quietly. The stress of being trapped combined with the accusations against our principal was overwhelming for someone so young. "You're lying," Tyler said angrily. "Dr. Harrison would never do something like that. He's been at this school for 15 years. "Has he?" the voice asked. "Have you ever actually verified his credentials, checked his employment history, investigated his financial background? Or did you just accept what you were told because he's in a position of authority?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. As journalists, we prided ourselves on fact-checking and verification, but we'd never thought to investigate our own school's administration. "The evidence is scattered throughout the building," the voice explained. "Financial records hidden in filing cabinets, email communications stored on backup servers, bank statements concealed in personal offices. But accessing it requires getting out of this room, and that won't happen until you demonstrate a real commitment to investigative journalism." Amanda was working on something at the layout table, trying to piece together information from memory. "Even if what you're saying is true," she said, "this isn't how journalism works. You don't kidnap reporters and force them to investigate stories." "Don't I?" the voice replied. "Some of the most important journalism in history has been done under duress. War correspondents, investigative reporters exposing organized crime, journalists working under authoritarian regimes. Sometimes the truth can only be uncovered when people are willing to take risks." The cold was becoming unbearable, and we were all shivering uncontrollably. Several of us were showing signs of hypothermia, confusion, slurred speech, loss of coordination. "We need to get out of here," I said, my teeth chattering. "This is dangerous. People could die from exposure." "Then perhaps you should take the investigation seriously," the voice suggested. "The environmental controls will return to normal once you demonstrate a genuine commitment to uncovering the truth." Ben was trying to find some way to break down the door or access the ventilation system. "There has to be an emergency exit or something," he said, searching desperately around the small room. "The only exit is through the truth," the voice said. "I've prepared a series of questions about Dr. Harrison's financial activities. Answer them correctly, using the investigative skills you claim to possess, and the door will unlock." Jessica was organizing the few resources we had available: old newspapers, reference materials, notes from previous stories. "What kind of questions?" she asked. Questions that require you to think like a real journalist, the voice explained. Questions about financial discrepancies, unexplained expenditures, and suspicious patterns in the school's budget reports. The voice began presenting us with detailed questions about the school's finances, asking us to identify irregularities and explain how we would investigate them further. It was like a twisted journalism exam, conducted under conditions of extreme stress and physical discomfort. As we worked through the questions, something strange happened. Despite the fear and cold, we began to function as a real investigative team. Amanda's analytical skills, Tyler's attention to detail, Jessica's ability to see patterns, Ben's visual memory, and even Katie's fresh perspective all contributed to our understanding of the financial irregularities being described. "You're beginning to understand," the voice said after we'd correctly identified several suspicious transactions. "This is what real journalism looks like. It's not just writing about school dances and football games. It's about holding powerful people accountable for their actions." But as we continued working, the conditions in the office became more dangerous. The temperature was now well below freezing, and several of us were showing serious signs of hypothermia. Katie had stopped shivering, which was actually a bad sign. "We need medical attention," I said, my voice slurred from the cold. "This has gone too far." "Then perhaps you should focus on the final question," the voice replied. Where would Dr. Harrison hide the most incriminating evidence of his financial crimes? That's when we heard something that gave us hope. Sirens outside the building. Multiple sirens getting closer and closer. "It seems our investigative session is about to be interrupted," the voice said, and for the first time there was a note of concern in the electronic tone. The lights suddenly came back on, temporarily blinding us after being in darkness for so long. The heating system resumed normal operation, and we could hear the electronic lock on the door disengaging. "Remember this lesson," the voice said as we heard police officers entering the building. "Remember that real journalism requires courage, persistence, and a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. And remember that the truth is often hidden by those who have the most to lose." The door opened, and we were greeted by paramedics and police officers. Several of us needed treatment for hypothermia, and Katie had to be hospitalized overnight for observation. The investigation that followed revealed the extent of the intrusion. The person responsible had indeed installed sophisticated surveillance and control equipment throughout the school. They had been monitoring our newspaper's activities for months, studying our work, and planning this elaborate scenario. Most disturbing was the discovery that the accusations against Dr. Harrison were partially true. While the specific details presented during our captivity were exaggerated, there were indeed financial irregularities in the school's budget that warranted investigation. The perpetrator was eventually identified as a former investigative journalist who had been fired from a major newspaper for fabricating sources and manipulating evidence. He had become obsessed with what he saw as the decline of serious journalism in schools and society. He was arrested and sentenced to 12 years in prison for kidnapping and endangerment. But the questions he had raised about journalistic integrity and the responsibility of student media continued to resonate with those of us who had been there. The experience changed how our newspaper operated. We began doing more investigative work, fact-checking more rigorously, and asking harder questions about school policies and administration. Dr. Harrison eventually resigned after a proper investigation revealed financial mismanagement, though nothing as dramatic as what had been alleged. For those of us who were in that office, the incident served as a harsh introduction to the ethical complexities of journalism. We learned that the pursuit of truth can be dangerous, that powerful people often have secrets worth protecting, and that journalists sometimes face pressure and intimidation. But we also learned that real journalism isn't about sensationalism or manufactured drama. It's about careful research, ethical reporting, and a commitment to serving the public interest. The fear and coercion we experienced that night didn't make us better journalists. It just made us more aware of how the tools of journalism can be misused by those with ulterior motives. I went on to study journalism in college, partly because of that experience. I wanted to understand how to pursue important stories responsibly, without resorting to the kind of manipulation and exploitation we had experienced. And the lesson that stayed with me most was that journalism is ultimately about serving the community, not about personal glory or dramatic revelations. The best stories are often the ones that require patience, persistence, and respect for the people involved, qualities that can't be forced through fear or coercion. I was a senior at Oakwood High School and co-chair of the yearbook committee. It was a responsibility I'd taken on because I loved photography and design, and I wanted to create something memorable for our graduating class. Our yearbook, The Oak, was always one of the most anticipated publications of the year, capturing everything from sports victories to academic achievements to candid moments of student life. This particular Thursday evening in late April, our committee was meeting in the journalism classroom to finalize the senior section. We were behind schedule and needed to get the final layouts to the printing company by Friday morning. The journalism classroom was located on the second floor of the main building, with large windows overlooking the student parking lot and access to the school's photo lab and computer equipment. Our committee that night consisted of 8 people. Myself as co-chair, my co-chair Elena Martinez, layout editor David Kim, photography editor Ashley Thompson, copy editor Marcus Williams, and 3 underclassmen who helped with various tasks. Sophomores Grace Chen and Tyler Brooks, and freshman Maya Patel. We'd been working for about 3 hours, sorting through hundreds of photos and finalizing page designs, when the building's fire alarm went off. But instead of the steady, familiar tone we knew from monthly drills, this was a different pattern. Short bursts, followed by longer tones that we'd never heard before. "That's not the fire alarm," Elena said, looking up from her computer. "That sounds like the emergency lockdown signal." Before anyone could respond, the lights in the classroom went out completely. Not just dimmed, total darkness. The computer shut down, and even the emergency lighting strips along the floor failed to activate. "Power outage," David said, pulling out his phone to use as a flashlight. But why would the lockdown alarm be going off? When we tried to use our phones to call for help or contact our parents, we discovered that none of them had any signal. Not weak reception. Completely dead. No bars, no data, nothing. "That's impossible," Ashley said, checking her phone repeatedly. "I had full signal 5 minutes ago." Marcus went to try the classroom door, but when he turned the handle, it wouldn't open. "It's locked," he said, pushing against it. "But this door doesn't lock from the inside. There's no mechanism for it." Grace was starting to panic. "What's happening? Why can't we get out?" That's when we heard the voice. It came through the classroom's intercom system, which was normally only used for morning announcements. The voice was calm and measured, but there was something unsettling about its tone. "Good evening, yearbook committee. I hope you're prepared for a very special photo session." We all looked at each other in confusion and growing alarm. The voice didn't belong to any teacher or administrator we recognized. "Who is this?" I called out toward the intercom speaker. "Someone who's been watching your work very closely," the voice replied. "Someone who understands the power of images to tell stories, preserve memories, and reveal truths that people would prefer to keep hidden." Elena was trying to restart her computer, but nothing happened when she pressed the power button. "All the equipment is dead," she said. "Traditional tools won't be necessary for tonight's project," the voice continued. "You'll be creating a very different kind of yearbook entry, one that captures the real story of what happens at Oakwood High School." The temperature in the classroom began to drop noticeably. We could hear the ventilation system working, but instead of circulating warm air, it was pumping in cold air from outside. "This is kidnapping," Marcus said loudly. "You can't just trap us in here." "Can I?" the voice replied with what sounded like amusement. "I've already done it. The door is secured with a custom electronic lock. Your communications are being jammed. The building's environmental systems are under my control. Consider this a behind-the-scenes look at how real stories are created." Tyler was examining the door more closely with his phone's flashlight. "There's some kind of device attached to the lock mechanism," he said. "It looks like it was installed recently." "Very observant," the voice said. "That's the kind of attention to detail that makes good photography. But observation is only the first step. Real storytelling requires courage to document uncomfortable truths." The cold was becoming more intense, and we were all starting to shiver. Maya, our youngest committee member, was beginning to cry quietly. "What do you want from us?" Ashley asked. "I want you to create a photo essay," the voice explained. "A documentation of the real Oakwood High School experience. Not the sanitized version you put in your yearbook, but the truth about what happens in these halls." David was searching through the filing cabinets in the classroom, looking for anything that might help us understand the situation. "What kind of truth are you talking about?" "The truth about the bullying that your administration ignores," the voice replied. "The truth about the favoritism, the cover-ups, the students who suffer in silence, while others pretend everything is perfect." The temperature continued to drop, and we were all huddling together for warmth. The classroom felt like a freezer, and our breath was becoming visible in the beam of our phone flashlights. "Your yearbook is a lie," the voice continued. "Page after page of smiling faces and happy moments, while the real stories of pain and injustice go untold. Tonight, you're going to document the truth." Elena was trying to piece together what was happening. "Even if there are problems at our school," she said, "this isn't how you address them. You don't kidnap students and force them to create propaganda." "Propaganda?" the voice asked. "Or journalism? Some of the most important documentation in history has been created under duress. War photographers, investigative journalists, whistleblowers, they all face danger to reveal the truth." Grace was shivering uncontrollably, and Tyler was showing signs of hypothermia. The stress of being trapped combined with the extreme cold was becoming dangerous. "We need medical attention," I said, my teeth chattering. "This is going too far." "Then perhaps you should focus on the assignment," the voice suggested. "The environmental controls will return to normal once you demonstrate a genuine commitment to documenting the real Oakwood High School experience." Ashley was organizing the few resources we had available: cameras, notebooks, and some printed photos from our earlier work. "What exactly do you want us to document?" she asked. "I've prepared a series of scenarios for you to photograph and write about," the voice explained. "Situations that represent the hidden reality of student life at this school." The voice began describing detailed scenarios involving bullying, academic pressure, social exclusion, and an administrative indifference. It was like a twisted photography assignment, asking us to create images and stories that captured the darker aspects of high school life. "You have access to the school's photo archives," the voice continued. "Hidden in the filing cabinets and computer servers are images and documents that tell the real story of this institution. Your job is to find them and create a truthful narrative." As we worked through the assignment, something disturbing became clear. The scenarios being described weren't entirely fictional. They were based on real events that had happened at our school, incidents that had been covered up or minimized by the administration. "You're beginning to understand," the voice said, as we uncovered more evidence of the problems being described. "This is what real journalism looks like. It's not just capturing happy moments and celebrating achievements. It's about holding institutions accountable for their failures." Marcus was examining some of the documents we'd found. "Some of this stuff is really disturbing," he said quietly. "I had no idea these things were happening." "Of course you didn't," the voice replied, "because the people in charge made sure you didn't. They created a narrative of success and happiness while ignoring the students who were suffering. But as we continued working, the conditions in the classroom became more dangerous. The temperature was now well below freezing, and several of us were showing serious signs of hypothermia. Maya had stopped responding to questions, which was a bad sign. "We need help," Elena said, her voice slurred from the cold. "Someone could die from exposure." "Then perhaps you should complete the final assignment," the voice replied. "Create a photo essay that tells the complete truth about Oakwood High School, including the administration's role in covering up these problems." That's when we heard something that gave us hope. The sound of vehicles pulling into the parking lot outside. Multiple vehicles with engines running and doors slamming. "It seems our documentation session is about to be interrupted," the voice said, and for the first time there was a note of concern in the tone. The lights suddenly came back on, temporarily blinding us after being in darkness for so long. The heating system resumed normal operation, and we could hear the electronic lock on the door disengaging. "Remember this lesson," the voice said as we heard police officers entering the building. "Remember that real storytelling requires courage to document uncomfortable truths. And remember that the images you choose to preserve shape how history is remembered." Paramedics rushed into the classroom and immediately began treating us for hypothermia. Maya had to be hospitalized overnight, and several others needed extended medical attention. The investigation that followed revealed the extent of the intrusion. The person responsible had installed sophisticated surveillance and control equipment throughout the school, and had been monitoring our yearbook activities for months. Most disturbing was the discovery that many of the accusations about administrative cover-ups were true. While the specific scenarios presented during our captivity were dramatized, there were indeed serious problems at our school that had been systematically ignored or minimized. The perpetrator was eventually identified as a former Oakwood student who had graduated 5 years earlier after experiencing severe bullying that the administration had failed to address. He had become obsessed with exposing what he saw as the school's culture of denial and image management. He was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison for kidnapping and endangerment. But the revelations about the school's problems led to significant changes in policies and leadership. The experience changed how our yearbook operated. We began including more diverse perspectives, addressing difficult topics, and asking harder questions about student experiences. The administration, facing public scrutiny, implemented new anti-bullying programs and transparency measures. For those of us who were in that classroom, the incident served as a harsh introduction to the ethical complexities of documentation and storytelling. We learned that the choice of what to include or exclude from historical records has real consequences for the people involved. But we also learned that truth-telling doesn't require coercion or manipulation. The best journalism and documentation comes from voluntary cooperation, ethical research methods, and respect for the dignity of all subjects. I went on to study photojournalism in college, partly because of that experience. I wanted to understand how to document important stories responsibly without resorting to the kind of exploitation and endangerment we had experienced. The lesson that stayed with me most was that the power to shape narratives comes with enormous responsibility. Whether creating a yearbook, a news story, or any other form of documentation, we have an obligation to be truthful, fair, and respectful of the people whose stories we're telling. The yearbook we eventually published that year was different from any previous edition. It included more honest portrayals of student life, acknowledgement of the school's problems, and a commitment to ongoing improvement. It wasn't as polished or cheerful as previous years, but it was more truthful. That experience taught me that real storytelling isn't about creating perfect narratives or hiding uncomfortable realities. It's about finding ways to document the full complexity of human experience while maintaining respect for the people involved and commitment to their welfare. I was a junior at Millbrook High School and president of our chess club. It wasn't the most popular extracurricular activity, but we had a dedicated group of about 15 members who met twice a week to practice and compete. Our club had been gaining recognition lately, placing well in regional tournaments and attracting some serious players who were considering chess scholarships for college. This particular Friday evening in October, we were hosting our annual internal tournament to determine who would represent our school at the state championship. The tournament was being held in Mr. Petrov's mathematics classroom, which had become our unofficial chess headquarters. Mr. Petrov, our faculty advisor, was a former competitive player himself and had helped transform our small club into a legitimate force in scholastic chess. 8 of our strongest players had qualified for the tournament. Myself, senior captain Lisa Chen, sophomore prodigy Alex Rodriguez, junior Sarah Kim, seniors Marcus Thompson and David Park, and sophomores Emma Walsh and Tyler Brooks. We were playing a round-robin format, with each player facing every other player once, and the top 3 finishers earning spots on the state team. The mathematics classroom was perfect for our tournament. It had 8 tables arranged in a square formation, allowing for multiple games to be played simultaneously while maintaining the quiet, focused atmosphere that serious chess requires. Mr. Petrov had even borrowed some of the school's digital chess clocks to make the event feel more official. We'd been playing for about 2 hours, and I was in the middle of a particularly intense game against Lisa when the building's lights flickered and then went out completely. Not just dimmed, total darkness. The digital chess clocks stopped working, and even the emergency lighting failed to activate. "Power outage," Mr. Petrov said, pulling out his phone to use as a flashlight. "Probably just a blown transformer. We'll have to suspend the tournament until the power comes back." But when we tried to use our phones to call the main office or contact our parents, we discovered that none of them had any signal. Not weak reception. Completely dead. No bars, no data, nothing. "That's strange," Alex said, checking his phone repeatedly. "I had full signal when we started playing." Sarah went to try the classroom door, but when she turned the handle, it wouldn't open. "It's locked," she said, pushing against it. "But Mr. Petrov? You didn't lock it, did you?" Mr. Petrov joined her at the door, trying his key, but it wouldn't turn. "This doesn't make sense," he said. "The lock mechanism seems to have been changed." That's when we heard the voice. It came through speakers that we didn't even know existed in the classroom. Speakers that must have been installed recently because they'd never been active before. "Good evening, chess players. I hope you're ready for a very different kind of game." The voice was electronically distorted, making it impossible to determine the speaker's age or gender. It sounded cold and calculating, like a computer program designed to mimic human speech. "Who is this?" Mr. Petrov demanded. "Identify yourself immediately." "I am someone who appreciates strategic thinking," the voice replied. "Someone who understands that chess is more than just a game. It's a metaphor for life, for power, for the ability to think several moves ahead." Lisa was trying to restart one of the chess clocks, but nothing happened when she pressed the buttons. "All the electronic equipment is dead," she said. "Traditional tools won't be necessary for tonight's match," the voice continued. "You'll be playing a very different kind of chess. One where the stakes are considerably higher than a spot on the state team." The temperature in the classroom began to drop noticeably. We could hear the ventilation system working, but instead of circulating warm air, it was pumping in cold air from outside. "This is kidnapping," Marcus said loudly. "You can't just trap us in here." "Can I?" the voice replied with what sounded like amusement. "I've already done it. The door is secured, your communications are blocked, and the environmental systems are under my control. Consider this a masterclass in strategic thinking." David was examining the door more closely with his phone's flashlight. "There's some kind of electronic device attached to the lock," he said. "It looks like it was installed recently." "Very observant," the voice said. "That's the kind of pattern recognition that makes good chess players. But observation is only the first step. Real strategy requires the ability to anticipate your opponent's moves." The cold was becoming more intense, and we were all starting to shiver. Emma and Tyler, our youngest members, were beginning to look scared. "What do you want from us?" I asked. "I want to play a game," the voice explained. "A chess variant that I've designed specifically for this occasion. One that will test not just your tactical skills, but your moral reasoning and decision-making under pressure." Mr. Petrov was searching through his desk drawers, looking for anything that might help us understand the situation. "What kind of game are you talking about?" "A game where each move has consequences beyond the board," the voice replied, "where the pieces represent real people, and the decisions you make affect their welfare." The temperature continued to drop, and we were all huddling together for warmth. The classroom felt like a freezer, and our breath was becoming visible in the beam of our phone flashlights. "I've prepared a special chess set for tonight's match," the voice continued. "Each piece is connected to a different aspect of your school's infrastructure. The heating system, the security protocols, the fire suppression system, even the emergency communication networks." Sarah was trying to piece together what was happening. "You're saying that moving chess pieces will affect the building systems?" "Exactly," the voice confirmed. "Every move you make will have real-world consequences. Capture an opponent's piece, and you might disable their access to heat. Put someone in check, and you might trigger a security lockdown in their section of the building." Alex was examining the chess sets on the tables, which had indeed been replaced with electronic versions we'd never seen before. "These aren't irregular sets," he said. "These have some kind of sensors or transmitters built into them." "Very good," the voice said approvingly. "Those are custom-built pieces that interface with the building's control systems. Each piece represents a different group of people currently in the school: students, teachers, custodial staff, security personnel." The implications of what the voice was describing began to sink in. We weren't just playing a game, we were being asked to make decisions that could affect the safety and comfort of real people. "This is insane," Lisa said. "We're not going to play some twisted game where people could get hurt." "Aren't you?" the voice asked. "You're already playing. The game began the moment you entered this room. The question now is whether you'll play strategically or allow chaos to determine the outcome." Emma was crying quietly, and Tyler was showing signs of hypothermia. The stress of being trapped combined with the extreme cold was becoming dangerous. "We need medical attention," Mr. Petrov said, his voice shaking from the cold. "These students could be seriously injured." "Then perhaps you should focus on the game," the voice suggested. "The environmental controls will return to normal based on how well you play. Make good moves, and conditions improve. Make poor moves, and things get worse." The voice began explaining the rules of the variant chess game in detail. It was a complex system where traditional chess moves were combined with real-world consequences affecting different areas of the school building. "The goal is not just to win the game," the voice explained, "but to minimize harm to the people represented by the pieces. You must think strategically about both the chess position and the human cost of your decisions." As we began to understand the rules, something disturbing became clear. The game was designed to force us into impossible moral choices. Every move that improved our chess position seemed to have negative consequences for someone else in the building. "You're beginning to understand," the voice said, as we struggled with the ethical implications of each potential move. "This is what real strategic thinking looks like. It's not just about winning, it's about considering the broader consequences of your actions." Marcus was studying the electronic chessboard carefully. "Some of these moves would put people in danger," he said. "We can't make decisions that might hurt innocent people." "But if you don't play optimally," the voice replied, "the consequences could be even worse. Sometimes the best strategic choice requires accepting short-term harm to prevent greater long-term damage." The temperature was now dangerously low, and several of us were showing serious signs of hypothermia. Mr. Petrov was trying to keep everyone conscious and alert, but the situation was becoming critical. "We need to end this," Sarah said, her speech slurred from the cold. people are going to die if this continues. Then make your final move, the voice replied. Choose the strategy that you believe will result in the best overall outcome. That's when we heard something that changed everything. The sound of helicopters outside the building. Multiple helicopters getting closer and closer. It seems our game is about to be interrupted, the voice said. And for the first time there was a note of concern in the electronic tone. The lights suddenly came back on, temporarily blinding us after being in darkness for so long. The heating system resumed normal operation, and we could hear the electronic lock on the door disengaging. Remember this lesson, the voice said, as we heard tactical teams entering the building. Remember that every decision has consequences beyond what you can see. And remember that the best strategies consider not just victory, but the welfare of everyone affected by your choices. Paramedics rushed into the classroom and immediately began treating us for hypothermia. Tyler and Emma had to be hospitalized overnight, and several others needed extended medical attention. The investigation that followed revealed the extent of the intrusion. The person responsible had installed sophisticated control systems throughout the school and had been monitoring our chess club activities for weeks. The perpetrator was eventually identified as a former computer programmer who had been a competitive chess player in his youth. He had become obsessed with what he saw as the disconnect between strategic thinking in games and ethical decision-making was in real life. He was arrested and sentenced to 15 years in prison for kidnapping and endangerment. But the questions he had raised about the relationship between strategic thinking and moral responsibility continued to resonate with those of us who had been there. The experience changed how I thought about chess and strategy. The realization that every decision has consequences beyond the immediate game board was something that stayed with me long after the physical trauma had healed. Our chess club continued to meet and compete, but we began incorporating discussions about ethics and decision-making into our practice sessions. Mr. Petrov, who felt responsible for what had happened, became an advocate for teaching strategic thinking alongside moral reasoning. For those of us who were in that classroom, the incident served as a harsh introduction to the complexities of leadership and decision-making under pressure. We learned that the ability to think strategically is only valuable when it's combined with ethical reasoning and concern for others. I went on to study philosophy and game theory in college, partly because of that experience. I wanted to understand how strategic thinking could be applied to real-world problems without losing sight of human welfare and moral considerations. The lesson that stayed with me most was that the best strategies are those that consider not just immediate goals, but long-term consequences and the welfare of everyone affected by our decisions. Whether playing chess, making business decisions, or navigating personal relationships, the principles of ethical strategic thinking remain the same. The tournament we had been playing that night was never completed, but in a way, we all learned more about strategy and decision-making in those few hours than we had in years of regular chess practice. The difference was that the lessons came at a cost that no game should ever require.